Okay. So I think that we have plenty of people already joined us. So I'll just introduce you. So first, I would like to welcome everybody for coming to our second talk. And I'm very happy to introduce our first guest lecturer in our fall seminar, Science, Faith and Superstition. The seminar is funded by Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion and Templeton Foundation. And our first guest is Professor Steve Fuller. Professor Steve Fuller is Auguste Comte Professor of Social Epistemology at the University of Warwick. He published 26 books. Am I right, Steve?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
So 26.
So far, you know.
So far, of course. And is best known for his foundational work in social epistemology. Today, Steve will be talking about scientific revolution as Augustinian modernism. And Steve, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Lil, and everyone for showing up. The way I'm going to do this, I given that there seems to be about an hour allotted for this, I'm going to speak for maybe 40 minutes and then open it up for questions. So I'm sure you'll have a lot of things to raise, and I want to leave some time for that. The first thing I want to do is to say, first of all, in a very direct kind of way, that this is a topic near and dear to me. And, you know, if we talk about the broad area of what is the relationship between science and religion, and what I'm going to present today is somewhat different from the two alternatives that Lil presented in her first lecture. If you have watched the first lecture, I thought it was very instructive in presenting two paradigms about the relationship between science and religion. One is basically an oppositional paradigm, right, where science and religion are basically opposed to each other. It's a sort of conflict view, and it's a view that, in a sense, really started to get a lot of traction in the late 19th century. And then there's this other view, which, in a way, in some senses is actually an older view, but got a lot of traction in the early 20th century. And this is the view of science and religion as complementary. And there's no conflict there. They're just sort of doing two things that, in a sense, fit together as part of what you might say some kind of holistic view of how you operate in the world. Okay. And the view I'm going to present here, which I'm calling Augustinian Modernism, is kind of a third perspective, and I think it's the perspective that, in a way, captures what the people who started what we now call the scientific revolution were up to. Because the people who started the scientific revolution did not belong to either of these two camps that Lil outlined. They belong to a different camp, and this is a camp that roughly says that science redeems the concepts of religion. Right, if you know, if that, and so there in a sense there is no conflict, but there is a much tighter relationship actually, and so one way to think about this, and this is certainly the way I have written about it, is that, in a sense, you might say religion sets the framework, so certain kinds of basic concepts, metaphysical orientations. So the idea, for example, that there is a universe, that the universe is intelligible, and it's not only intelligible, but it's subject to laws. You know, basically that kind of framework that I suppose most clearly in the early modern period that we'd associate with Newtonian mechanics, that in a sense, that kind of metaphysical horizon is actually primarily a theological horizon. It's not necessarily the most obvious way to think about how reality is organized. But if you have a certain kind of theological perspective, a kind of monotheistic perspective, one where you kind of take seriously the idea that you can get into the mind of God, right, that God created the world, and you can somehow, in a way, recapitulate that. You can somehow reverse engineer it, you might say, and figure out what were the principles by which God did this. Right, that's a particular theological horizon, one that has been periodically regarded as quite heretical in the history of the monotheistic religions, not just Christianity. But that's actually the framework. That is the framework from which then modern science comes. It comes after assuming all of those metaphysical assumptions, and those metaphysical assumptions make most sense as theological ones. In other words, if you want to ground the intuitiveness of it, it would be most obvious theologically. And I say this, of course, because as we all know, right, there is a sense in which there are all cultures have forms of knowledge, including very advanced forms of knowledge. And usually they do have stuff that we might call religious practices, even if they don't necessarily believe in a god or a set of gods. But nevertheless, they don't tend to have this particular character. At least if you're doing kind of an inventory of all the world's cultures, there is a sense in which this particular way of looking at the world, which leads from theology into science, is quite a distinctive one. Okay. And so, for example, part of the context in which this idea of the scientific revolution gets developed as a concept. And remember, when we say the scientific revolution, of course, we're talking about something that primarily happened in the 17th century, give or take a few decades on either side. But as a term, as a phrase that is widely used by both historians and philosophers, it really dates from the 1930s and 40s. Okay, and the 1950s was when it really started to get popularized. And so you don't actually have the phrase scientific revolution very much in circulation before the 1930s. Okay, even though it is referring to something, right, that happened 200 years earlier. So that's kind of an interesting thing in its own right, because if you look at other terms that we use for talking about the early modern period, such as the Renaissance, the Reformation, right, those terms are older. Right? Those terms are older. I mean, the Renaissance itself is kind of a mid-19th century thing, but still that's older than the 1930s, okay? And so the scientific revolution as a kind of concept is a relatively modern one. And one of the contexts in which this concept was developed was about trying to identify the uniqueness of the Western way of the world, right? So that is also part of what's in the frame here. And so another aspect of this, of talking about the scientific revolution that people often bring up, and I think it's, at least worth flagging here, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but people might want to raise it in the questions, is why didn't it happen in China? Right. So the question about the Joseph Needham question, Joseph Needham was this biochemist at Cambridge who wrote a multi-volume history of science and civilization in China, which is still very much a benchmark work. And this set of works is in a way framed by the question, given that China by far was the most advanced in terms of wealth, in terms of political organization, right, in terms of cultural sophistication and all the rest of it, even as we're getting into the early modern period in the West, China is, and it's generally recognized to be, right, Westerners aren't oblivious to this. They know that China is a superior place from the standpoint of all of those indicators. Nevertheless, China was not the place where the scientific revolution happened. Okay. And so it's with that in mind, that then starts making, framing the issue, makes you kind of say, well, what's distinctive? What is specific that's going on? Right. And Joseph Needham, in a way, gives a kind of answer that is quite, you might say, compatible with the way in which we think about how the scientific revolution happened in the West. So he's kind of a fellow traveler in this kind of thinking that makes a big deal about the scientific revolution. And I'll say something about that later. But I think the key point here that we want to hold on to for a moment is the idea that when we want to talk about the distinctiveness scientific revolution as a modern phenomenon, it's very easy, of course, correct in a way, to say, well, a lot of the concepts from the scientific revolution. So there's a kind of revival of Epicureanism going on, a revival of Pythagoreanism going on, right? So in terms of the way one thinks about material reality on the one hand, the way one thinks about mathematics as providing the structure of reality on the other, right? There's a lot of revival of a lot of this Greek stuff, right? That's going on during this period. There's no doubt about that, of course. But the point is that that by itself, you might then say, well, didn't the Greeks have it? right? Because and there are a lot of people out there who, in a sense, when they want to sort of diminish the significance of the scientific revolution, want to say, well, look, all those ideas that guys like Galileo and Newton and all the rest of them had, the Greeks already had it, other people already had it, other cultures already have it, right? You start trotting out India, China, everywhere, there are versions of all these things. Of course, there are versions of all these things, but the point about the scientific revolution is basically an organizational, institutional thing where these ideas start to have a certain kind of force in terms of not only guiding inquiry, but also the guiding in the way in which people think about their relationship to the world at a practical level. Okay. I mean, it's one thing to have Pythagoreanism as a kind of cult of numbers, essentially, right? Where a few people, hang around, ruminating about the cosmos and so forth, and write a few equations down and then just spend most of their time in a stupor, right? Versus someone actually taking all of this mathematics and trying to reconstruct the world on the basis of it, as it were, to bring out its mathematical qualities more clearly. And that is something that happened with the scientific revolution, okay? And so we're not just talking about a bunch of disconnected ideas that have been around for centuries. We're talking about the way they are organized, okay? And this then brings up the question of what motivates that, right? What motivates people to suddenly put ideas together in a certain kind of way that it then has all of these kind of knock-on effects in terms of productive technologies, in terms of changing the way in which people think about politics and the economy and everything else, right? And of course, the established church becomes, in a sense, on the in the firing line of all of this stuff. Okay, because of course the established church, which is the underwriter of the university system, right, in a sense, is the official kind of institutional bulwark for knowledge as it's produced. And so everybody has some kind of connection to that, regardless of where they end up in terms of their own inquiries, right? So everybody, in a sense, starts in the church, right? And then the question goes, then becomes, do they stay there, right? And as they move away, how do they move away, and so forth. Okay, so this is in a sense kind of what So this is kind of the initial, you might say, prospectus of what I'm talking about here. Now let's move into a little more kind of theological detail and try to bring in what is the Augustinian side of this, right? So you all know Saint Augustine, one of the great fathers of the church. We're talking 4th, 5th century A.D. Bishop of Hippo, very famous for his confessions, the City of God, lots of other stuff. And in particular, I would flag here a very famous commentary on Genesis. Okay, and Genesis, the first book of the Bible. And and of course, in this early period of the church, where in a sense the constitution of the Bible is very much up for grabs. There are various kinds of councils and synods that are being convened by bishops to sort of sort this out. And in a way, Augustine is one of the first people, in a way, to hold a position of power when things are beginning to settle down in that regard. And so he has a commentary on Genesis that in a way becomes very influential in the early modern period. I mean, I think it's fair to say, probably having to do with the lack of availability of books and stuff of that kind, that the extent to which people are actually reading stuff, is very uncertain for much of this period until we get into the 15th, 16th century. Okay. And it's quite clear that there is a kind of revival of this particular way in which Augustine read Genesis. And Augustine is a kind of, one thing you could say about him is he's all, in a sense, already modernist in that he tends to make some very sharp distinctions. He tends to draw some clear lines about stuff. And that probably suited this sort of ecclesiastical role that he had, but intellectually, so there's a lot of sharpness in his thinking, and so two concepts that stand out for him in his interpretation of Genesis is original sin, and our having been created in the image and likeness of God. Okay, so now these two notions don't sit very well together, right? But Augustine says both of them are essential for defining what a human being is. Okay, and in a sense, this is the distinctive Augustinian doctrine: is keeping these two things, as it were, together. Because there was at the risk of belaboring the obvious, of course, the idea we're creating the image and likeness of God, we're the privileged creatures of God, right? This is quite clear from Genesis. But of course, then there's the fall, right? And the fall is manifested as original sin that carries on intergenerationally among humanity in the fallen state. Okay. Now the tendency, and this is, by the way, a point I want to mention one book here at this point that I think is quite useful in terms of retracing some of the history I'm going to be talking about in a very short form, which was a person mentioned by Little last week, Peter Harrison, the book on the fall of man and the origins of modern science, 2007, with Cambridge. And one of the points, and so Harrison is very much on top, especially of the role of original sin in the rise of modern science. And so one of the things that Harrison points out is that, notwithstanding the fact that Augustine flags original sin very, relatively early in terms of the history of church theology, nevertheless, that doctrine kind of dies, not dies exactly, but it tends to get mitigated over time. Okay, and just like the idea of human beings being created in the image of God, that also gets mitigated over time. So in other words, you might say the standing of humans in the first place, not so high, as Augustine would say, but then the fall that the humans have is not so low, as Augustine said either. You get something much more in the middle, right? And you get a sense that perhaps God has forgiven humans, right? And we have a kind of natural, we have a place in nature that in a sense is natural, and is one that in a sense that if we behave reasonably, everything should be okay in the long term. Okay, I mean, it's something, I vulgarize slightly, but in a sense, the message of Christianity was made much more palatable than, let's say, Augustine was inclined to make it, and that became kind of a default position in Christianity. And that, of course, made it easier for Christians to exist, you might say, in terms of their existential self-understanding. But what it did was it got rid of a lot of the sharpness, right? And so in a sense, what this kind of mitigated view of that we're not that fallen, but we weren't that great in the first place. One of the things that went along with that view, which became increasingly problematic over the 1,000 years that separates Augustine, or more than 1,000 years between Augustine and the scientific revolution, right, is the role of tradition, the role of established institutions like the church, even, right, monarchy, stuff like that. All of these things that, in a sense, largely derive their legitimacy from their longevity. Okay, and you see that if you have a strictly Augustinian view about human beings, then the last thing you would do is take for granted the idea that just because people have believed something for X number of centuries, or just because they've been following a certain kind of tradition for X number of centuries, that therefore they should carry on indefinitely and continue to do the same thing, right? Because if you really believe we're fallen, right, then we might be systematically mistaken in all kinds of very deep ways, and the fact that we just keep puttering along doesn't say anything terribly important epistemically, right? We just remain animals. Because remember, the other side of this is Augustine says we potentially have these godlike powers, right? And to be a god is not to be a great animal, right? To be God is to be something else. I mean, I think that's an important part of the Augustinian modernism as well, namely a very sharp understanding, very sharp distinction between what it means for human beings to, in some sense, have an element of the divine in them, and what it means for humans to be constituted as animals. These things are actually seen as kind of in opposition, much more strongly in opposition than what you got in normal Christianity, especially once Aristotle starts getting on the scene, and Thomas Aquinas and all these guys in the later part of the Middle Ages. Then you really get a very naturalized sort of version where the idea of the spirit becomes the organization of matter, right? It'd be, this kind of Aristotelian view of a soul, right, becomes very strong, and basically almost becomes identified with the spirit, okay? And so that kind of naturalism, that in a way uh, became very much part of later Christianity in the later Middle Ages. That's something that the Augustinians were against. Okay, one way you could see this in terms of how a lot of these scholastic debates Middle Ages. So we're talking here about, starting from the early 13th century, moving into the 15th century, right, with all these big guys like, Aquinas and Bonaventure first, and then Scotus and those people, is this kind of a shift in perspective with regard to, you might say, the dominant human faculty. Right, there was with Thomas Aquinas, and I think the establishment church view, the intellect was given primacy, but the intellect understood as something whose job it is to represent nature as it is, and it's almost like it's like a reflective. We're like the great mirrors of nature, right? It's something like that, and nature, as it were, reveals itself to us through our senses. Our senses should be trusted. They're largely reliable. And if we're open, we can see what nature, is like. And Aristotle, in a way, is kind of an exemplar of that kind of mentality. Okay. But the other view, which is the view, of Scotus and Occam and these guys who turn out to be much more important for this Augustinian modernism, is the will. Okay, so the importance of the will, where the will is understood as a kind of creative faculty. Okay, and so and there are several implications there, and one of the ways to see this is by a kind of shift that Duns Scotus. If you know anything about John Duns Scotus, one thing you'll know is he's a man. He's a very tricky man with words. He's a very sophisticated kind of guy. And one of the things that he does is he shifts the understanding of what possible means. Okay, and this is quite important for what goes on, because and it explains kind of the character of empiricism that starts to develop in the early modern era, which is really quite different from the Aristotle, natural observation kind of approach. If you ask Aristotle what is possible, Aristotle probably would say that what is possible is something that's already been displayed in nature a few times, right? So in other words, there's a sense in which possibility is kind of always kind of revealing itself, and there aren't hidden possibilities. There aren't, it's true we don't know what the future is, but the future is going to be some version of something that we've seen before, right? So Aristotle has a fairly kind of closed epistemic horizon when it gets right down to it. Whereas with Duns Scotus, the notion of possible isn't tied to, as it were, what's empirically regular, but rather it's tied to what's logically possible, what's conceivable. And that is very closely connected to a kind of idea of the will. If you understand the way in which God creates is by first surveying everything he could create and then creating the best thing, right? So in other words, it's a kind of, it's a mathematical projected space, right? And this is, by the way, what becomes the template for what in the early modern period gets called the a priori, right? When we talk about human beings as having a priori knowledge, whether we're talking about mathematics, or physics in the case of Comte, right? What we're talking about is that this kind of godlike ability to kind of know in advance all the stuff that's possible by virtue of logic, not so before experience, right? By virtue of logic, right? And then, as it were, God at least would enact a possibility in the world, right? And that's the act of will, okay? And if you look at the way in which Kant thinks about, what the relationship is between the human mind and the world and all this, it's something like that, except that human beings, in a sense, the sense in which the will, in a sense, is not this grandiose thing that God has that can bring all of the world into creation, but it is a kind of smaller version of that from the standpoint of how cognition works, okay? Now, see, reason why I'm saying all this is because what you start to see here is a kind of shift in the standing of the human being that's taking place. So the human being is no longer kind of a receptacle to represent nature, but rather the human being becomes something like a micro divinity, right? A being who in a way can create and understand everything in at least in principle, but of course not in fact. And what this then does, it kind of ratchets up the level of ambition that human beings have. Okay. And this is where you start to you have to get this, one thing that Harrison does in his book that I think is really useful is to does a kind of parallel analysis of John Calvin and Francis Bacon. Both of these guys are legally trained people. Neither of them really did science, but they were lawyers. And they make a lot of the same sorts of criticisms of the universities, right, of even the church, right, the Roman Church, and other kind of established institutions. And the points that they continue to make is the fact that because things have been around for such a long time, we somehow think they're natural, when in fact they've just become embedded, they become entrenched, they become, in a sense, systematic biases, right? And in fact, Francis Bacon is quite explicit when he talks about the idols, that basically he thinks most of the ways in which we encounter and deal with the world is biased in some very deep kind of way, and it's being reinforced in all kinds of manner, right? In all kinds of ways. And so now, but the point is, with both Calvin and Bacon, even though they recognize that there is this kind of, cognitively fallen nature to humans, right? In a sense, what they're saying is this is the product of humans, right? Humans doing it to other humans. And humans also have it within themselves to try to transcend that, right? But they have to take action. They have to take action. And even if that action is fallible and may not succeed, they nevertheless have it within themselves to be able to take action to transcend their systematic biases. And in fact, for both Calvin and Bacon, our standing as human beings rides on this, right? That we're not just docile animals, but that we can, as it were, rise to the occasion, right, of our godlike entitlement by doing this, right? And this is where science starts to play a very important role. And so what this does is it sort of shifts the whole complexion of how one thinks about observation and empiricism and all that kind of stuff. Because remember, if you want observation and you want empiricism, Aristotle's your man. He's got it, right? I mean, so there's a sense in which what was the standard view within Christianity was actually quite open. You might say the naturalistic observation. There was no problem there, actually. But here we're talking about a new kind of empiricism, and it's an empiricism that takes seriously the idea that everything, that the things that we normally see, the regularities that we track in the world, are only a subset of everything that's potentially out there, right? That there is a sense in which much of reality is hidden, right? Much of reality is hidden, and the fact that we are reinforced by certain kinds of observations and regularities that we experience in the world may in fact be dumbing us down, essentially, and not enabling us to realize the full potential of our being. And this is where experimentation becomes very important. And people like Bacon were quite dramatic sometimes in talking about this as torturing nature and, getting her to reveal her secrets. And you're probably familiar with some of that rhetoric that Francis Bacon uses, because Francis Bacon, right, he was the personal lawyer to King James I, and he was someone, truth be told, who was very enamored of the Inquisition as a form of judicial inquiry on the continent, right? In fact, he wanted to bring that into England, and in a sense, his way of thinking about the experimental method, where in some way you have to force nature to reveal her secrets, was very much modeled on regarding nature as a hostile witness. Right. And you see that this is a really different way thinking about observation and experience and so forth. It really involves a kind of suspicious attitude toward what appears before your eyes. Right. And but unlike the skeptics, right, and these people who say we have no way of resolving it, and so guys like Bacon and you can, all the other ones, Galileo, whatever, right, they claim to have methods, right? They have methods by which they will be able to penetrate the secrets of nature and reveal all of these new possibilities, right, that hadn't been explored before. And these new possibilities, and Bacon is explicit about this, right, will then, in a way, he sees this as a potential cornucopia, right, there'll be all kinds of discoveries that will come from this, and these discoveries will lead, right, to the improvement of the human condition and all of this kind of stuff, right? So So he sees great things ahead, right? But it does involve this kind of very fundamental shift in the attitude toward nature and toward experience, which is much more antagonistic, and in a way, much more relaxed with the idea of getting rid of established tradition and custom and all the rest of it. Okay, um, so this is kind of the mentality that we're talking about, that Augustinian modernism fosters. And the point is, of course, while these ambitions are unleashed, right? At the same time, the fallen nature of humanity is not off the table, right? So, in other words, there is quite a lot of discussion and quite a lot of self-awareness of our ability to make hasty judgments, overgeneralizations, all the rest of it, right? And so this the sort of thing that we associate with Karl Popper, the falsificationist ethic of science, is actually there, right? So it's actually there in the early modern period as a kind of a necessary complement, right? So Popper famously said, you needed bold conjectures and strong refutations, right? The reason why bold conjectures, in a way that speaks to the aspiration of the human mind, right? Our ability to actually think beyond what's immediately before us, right? So we need these bold hypotheses, but at the same time, we need strong tests of them because we equally realize, right, just how imperfect we are. Right, so you need this kind of dialectic going on at the same time, and the early modern period is basically where that happens in a way for the first time. Now, I think this is also related to other things that we associate the early modern period with, and I just want to, and here I want to pick up on the issue of Copernicus, because I haven't said anything about the great Copernicus yet, right? And in the advertisement for this talk, I was there talking next to some Copernican thing, and I want to say a little bit about that, because I do think, especially if you were, again, I don't know how much you guys, you probably do know this, I guess, right? Freud, I believe it's in Civilization and its Discontents. He talks about the three great displacements in the modern era, right? And where psychoanalysis is the final one, right? And the first one is done by Copernicus, the second by Darwin, and then by Freud. And they all involve these displacements, right? And the displacements basically are displacing the centrality of the human being, right? Because the way Freud portrays Copernicus, he sees Copernicus as showing that, humans on Earth are not the center of the universe, literally, right? We're just some small thing moving around, and that's the first displacement according to Freud. Now, I think that whole way of, and of course, Darwin's displacement is that, there's nothing special about humans. We're just another animal. And then Freud comes along and says, well, we're not even very rational, right? I mean, so there's nothing distinctive even there in terms of our minds. Now, I think this is a wrong way of looking at the history, and in particular of Copernicus. And I think this is a really important point. It goes to the coinage of the phrase scientific revolution in 1930s to 50s, as I was mentioning at the beginning. So there's this famous book that was published in 57 by Alexander Koyré, and you're probably familiar with him, Koyre, with an accent aigu. And it's called From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe, right? Series of lectures he gave. And that's a very interesting book, because I think if you take, so this book is basically about, in a way, how the modern worldview gets formed, and the break away from Aristotle and Ptolemy and so forth. And Koyré has a particular way of characterizing it, which is very much led at it's a kind of conceptually led kind of understanding of the scientific revolution. So he doesn't go into the experiments very much. And in fact, when Paul Feyerabend wrote his famous notorious book, right, Against Method, where he makes the argument that Galileo probably falsified his experiments. Can you mute, please? Mute. Okay. Can I go? Yeah. So when when Arist so let me backtrack a little bit.
Feyerabend.
Feyerabend, thank you, thank you very much. Yeah, so when Feyerabend writes this against method, which says that Galileo may have falsified his experiments, he was partly influenced by Koyray's book, because Koyré was making the argument that in a way Galileo could have deduced all the conclusions he made without having done any empirical work, given the kinds of starting assumptions and the metaphysical horizons he was working with, right? So in a sense, it would have made perfect sense for the experiments as described, right, in his dialogues, right, to have just been, as it were, pedagogical devices to illustrate for people what this means, right? Doesn't correspond to anything actually done, right, in the world, the way a normal experiment would be. But so the thing is, what you get very clearly, though, when you look at this, when you look at what Koyré is saying, is that there is a displacement that takes place, and the nature of the Copernican displacement is that we start to occupy the mind of God when trying to understand the universe. Right? That's the shift. We shift. Where we are in the picture shifts. So we are no longer imagining ourselves as beings on Earth when we do physics, because if we did, we would be doing Aristotle type stuff. But instead, we imagine ourselves from God's point of view, and therefore we can then start to think about the universe from first principles. How did it get created? But, you know, in what kind of logical structure, right? And you can even apply the kinds of principles that people would suppose God would have applied. So it's simple and elegant, mathematically tractable, rational, you know, intelligible to the human mind, right? All of these criteria, which become very, you know, very definitive of what modern science is, starts to come into play because the human is shifted. The human is shifted. It's no longer a creature planted on Earth, but rather is one who is identifying with the Creator and then trying to rethink the Creator's thoughts. And this has enormous amount of influence in all kinds of ways. So it's not by accident, for example, that, you know, especially as we move into the second half of the 17th century, right, the character of theology itself starts to change, and you start to get this branch of theology, again, inspired by St. Augustine, theodicy, right? Theodicy, right? In Greek, God's justice, God's, you know, justifying God's ways to men, right, as it's often put. And what this involves, right, is basically theologians and philosophers basically a sort of doing a kind of rational calculation of why God did this and why God did that, and then trying to see how it relates to other things God did, right? And so, you know, kind of a cost-benefit analysis of creation, right? This is kind of, in a way, what theodicy was. And there were various ways, you know, as it were, various strategies for doing this. And there were, you know, so, you know, Antoine Arnaud, you know, was into this, and Leibniz was into this, and Malebranche was into this. And there were a whole bunch of these guys. And a lot of this stuff carried on in the 18th century as natural theology. And of course, when we start to get to the late 18th century, we start to get people like Thomas Malthus coming along, and you know, with, you know, his kind of view about population and justifying, you know, why there's such massive deaths and so forth, and that's the tail end of theodicy. Basically, it becomes this kind of, you know, entree into political economy. Okay, and this is all of this, which again, a lot of religious people, I should say, throughout this period, a lot of religious people found very sacrilegious. And, you know, you should not be trying to get into God's mind and try to second guess what God's up to, right? But nevertheless, that turns out to be incredibly influential. And if we look at, you know, modern utilitarianism, okay, you know, and a lot of these kind of modern ethical viewpoints, and I would say even Kantianism, insofar as, you know, Kant wants you tradition of being able to legislate for everyone, that you know, in a sense, that's the residue of this kind of perspective that comes on the horizon, whereby human beings start to occupy the mind of God. You get a completely different sense of science. You get a completely different, right? And so this is the Augustinian modernism, right? And it's been incredibly powerful. But I would say the thing that and it's still powerful. But I would say the thing that started to challenge it, and here is where I do think Darwin kind of enters the picture. Okay, I think once people started to have a a very thoroughly naturalistic view of human beings, of the kind that Darwin was presenting in Origin of Species. Though already it was kind of beginning with Linnaeus, with the coinage of Homo sapiens for the upright ape. I think already you might say the rot began to set in then. But the point is that certainly by the time we get to Darwin, then there are a lot of questions that start to get asked, especially given, remember, so we're talking the late 19th century, right? We've got imperialism, we have all kinds of discontent taking place, right, throughout Europe and the world and everything. And so, and even though there has been this enormous amount of technological progress, which has led to a kind of globalization of the world through the telegraph, all of that was already happening in the late 19th century. At the same time, there were some fundamental doubts beginning about whether human beings, were really as great as they thought they were, given this kind of evidence and theorizing that Darwin was making, which basically said, we are just one among many animal species who come and go over billions of years. And this even led in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, right, to Darwin's great defender, Thomas Henry Huxley, right, to give a very famous lecture, Evolution and Ethics, where he actually ends up, basically conceding that, it looks like Darwin's view of the human being as just being a kind of upright ape who maybe has an overdeveloped forebrain, which leads human beings to come up with these very wild ideas, like they can understand the nature of the universe and all that kind of stuff. In other words, ideas that go well beyond what's necessary for survival and maybe even counter survival in a certain sense, right? That these big ideas that we have may in fact serve to undermine our adaptability to the natural world. And Huxley grants all this, right? That this may in fact be kind of what the Darwinian picture of human beings looks like. But then interestingly, Huxley says, but what makes us human is that we are counter selection, right? We are against this. So we stand against nature in a systematic way, and that is who we are, right? So he doesn't, it's not like he invokes a supernatural or anything explicit like that, though if you read the essay, you'll see that Huxley is very much informed by various kinds of theological views, actually. Even though he has all these great debates with priests and people like that, nevertheless, he's a very theologically informed and sophisticated person, in many cultures, by the way, the theologies of many cultures. But the point is, at the end, Huxley's view is an ethical view. He says that in a sense, what makes us human is and has been our ability to transcend and to go against the limits of nature. Okay, and that includes the selection pressures that are with us. And so, if Huxley were around now, let's say, and I think this is, very much the Augustinian modernist view, right? It would be very, more technological solutions to the problems that we have on Earth. Right, maybe even geoengineering, maybe going off into space, a lot of this transhumanist stuff, right, that we talk about now, I would say is kind of very much in the horizon of someone who wants to continue to maintain this kind of Augustinian modernist position today, okay? But as you know, there's a lot of resistance to it, a lot of, and the resistance comes in a way, I would say, not some of it is hostility, of course, but a lot of it, I think, is that it's seen, as too destructive. It's seen as not quite delivering what it's planning to do. It's kind of run out of steam in a certain way, this kind of way of seeing human beings. And so people are trying to, at least certain groups of people, by no means not everyone, but certain groups of people are trying to withdraw from it. And so then some of these, other ways of, as it were, relating religion and science, especially ones that try to be more compatibilist, that in a way lessen the ambitions for science to, as it were, to occupy the place of religion, then these things become much more palatable, I would say. And I think that's kind of where we are at the moment. But what I've been trying to do here in the talk is basically to kind of nail down what I think is quite distinctive and is theologically distinctive about the modern scientific worldview, because in a sense, we wouldn't have this modern scientific worldview without this very specific kind of theology that I've been talking about. And so I'll stop there and take some questions. I see some questions there already. You want to chair this?
No, you can take questions if you would like. Just
yeah, it's just I don't know who the names of the guy. I see this gentleman with his hand up.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, I had written also something in the comments, but my question's about Harvey's work in the biological tradition, the discovery of the circulation of the blood, which was a completely revolutionary change from the Galenic interpretation, which had existed 1,000 years, as important within biology and medicine as Galileo or the Copernican revolution. But nothing that you said seemed to me to be pertinent directly to that, the way it was to the things that Copernicus was talking about. Since this was it a displacement? It wasn't a displacement. It simply was an altered role of circulation of what happened to the blood. Would you comment or elaborate a little on, biology and medicine?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, okay. So, I didn't give, you might say I didn't give the whole worldview, in a sense. I really kind of focused on the stuff that you might say was leading on the high conceptual side. So the mathematical stuff, the more metaphysical stuff. But the part that I left out, which you're bringing up here, is the role that mechanism, that the machine-like character of organisms, that is also part of the picture. And this has a lot to do, interestingly, right? I think because you might say, okay, how does something like mechanism, the mechanistic worldview, right, as it is sometimes called, right? And so we're not just talking about Harvey and Newton, but Descartes, of course, haven't talked about him at all either. I think what we need to think here, and this is where the business of the image and likeness of God stuff becomes important, is that machines are seen as distinctly human creations, and so in a sense, part of the thing of the image and likeness thing is that in some sense, people, I think, in this period were prepared, as it were, to think they could learn something about God by learning something about humans and how humans create machines and stuff like that. And that there is a sense, a quite literal sense, and I think this would be true for the mechanistic physiologists, that what you're trying to do is reverse engineer the way in which God put people together, right? I mean, there's, one could perhaps put this in a more sophisticated way, but I think, so that's a very striking thing, right? I mean, that the image of the machine and thinking about everything as machines, and that you understand it once you're able to reduce it to a machine, right? I think is a reflection of the extent to which humans are using themselves as a model for understanding how God works. Okay.
Well, but there's nothing in Harvey, to my knowledge, on explicitly, even implicitly.
No, but Descartes, but it's clear in Descartes, and I think with a lot of these, and this is the other thing, right? That's really important about what happens in the early modern period, is a lot of the theological discussion goes underground, right, or doesn't get mentioned at all, largely because of the potentially heretical consequences of actually making quite explicit some of this stuff. Right? So if you're saying I'm doing medicine to figure out how God created organisms, right? I mean, in certain circles, that could be quite problematic, quite, contentious, right? I mean, and so it becomes increasingly common. And of course, the more we move into the modern era, it becomes even more common for all of the theological stuff to go underground, not to get mentioned, right? And the Royal Society, right? So we talk about the Royal Society, right? In 1660, right, part of its charter is leave religion at the door, right? Leave rhetoric at the door, leave politics at the door, right? If you're going to be transacting business with us about science, you can't talk about these other things. Why? Well, because they're potentially very contentious, right? They're very contentious from a metaphysical standpoint. and from the politics that are aside, that the politics that are associated with the different metaphysical positions. And so it's not surprising that a guy like Harvey wouldn't be going on about theology, in his writings. But I'd be really surprised if it hadn't crossed his mind. I mean,
but the interesting thing is, who was the man who? Sorry, it was somebody else who preceded him. Was it Bruno? Yeah, Giordano Bruno.
Giordano Bruno, yeah.
Right, who was actually burned at the stake for his theology, but had this a little bit of the concept of the pulmonary circulation.
Yes,
before Harvey.
Well, yes, and there's another one, Michael Servetus, who Calvin burned. A similar kind of deal. Okay, I mean, right. Yeah. These this was, hey, people get burned all the time for their sides back in those days. No, but the point was, Bruno's a good example, right? Because Galileo, who is slightly younger than Bruno, right, learned from the example of Bruno. Bruno sacrificing his life basically because he shot his mouth off too much, right? Galileo, as a result, made all of his arguments in much subtler ways, right? Much, rhetorically much craftier kinds of ways, which of course came out, once you see the transcripts of the Inquisition, right? You begin to see just how careful he's trying to be in saying stuff. And I think that gives you a sense of just how politically fraught these theological issues can be, right? And so, by the time you get to Harvey, people kind of know when to keep their mouths shut, I mean, no, seriously, this is
all right. Yeah. That argument, not disagree.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Is that you, Kei?
Yeah.
Kei Yoshida. This is the editor of the journal Philosophy of Social Sciences.
Well, thank you very much for your stimulating talk, as always. And but I was wondering, what do you think about instrumentalist view of science? And the reason why I'm asking this question is that people like Popper and his followers, tend to take a realist position. And they are saying that, scientific theories are aiming at objective truth and so forth. And I think that this is apparently a metaphysical position. And, you could say that, that is a, secularized version of the concept of God, right?
Yeah, the realism. The realist could be... Yes, that's
so there is no problem that realism can be interpreted in terms of what we are talking about. But if we drop such a metaphysical view, like as instrumentalists would do, then I was just wondering what you would think about
Okay, well, you probably know this, and I'm sure some of you listening will know this. So this was kind of a hot topic, not just with Popper and his followers, but in the turn of the century, when we do get into this very interesting, we start to get into this kind of conflict view of science and religion, and whether science is somehow overtaking religion and so forth, and especially in the context of how the curriculum works, and in places like France and so forth, more and more of the education system was being done by the state rather than by the church. So this is kind of a live political issue as well. And so the person who comes to mind in this context is Pierre Duhem, the French physicist, who of course is one of the people who, in a way, though he doesn't coin this phrase scientific revolution, he's certainly someone who starts to point in the direction that whatever happened to bring about modern science was theological, right? I mean, that point he nails. He gets that point, and so his own view. So he's regarded as an instrumentalist in the philosophy of science, and in fact, his view was very common among the Catholic thinkers, the Catholic. Philosophers of the time, because it basically gave this kind of divided settlement on science, right? Where in a sense, science has this kind of instrumental value. We're able to predict things. We're able to use it to improve our situation in the world. In a way, it's like the complementary view that Lil was talking about last week. The instrumentalist tends to have that kind of view, right? Whereas if we're talking about the metaphysical side of things, then we're not going to have science colonize that too with realism, right? No, what we're going to do is we're going to have a much more open space where, in a sense, you can fill it in with whatever metaphysics you want, which includes maybe a highly theistic metaphysics, and maybe even one that to a certain extent believes that in principle we might not even ever be able to figure out the ultimate causes in any kind of natural way, right? That in some sense we have to be, Duhem called his own view fideism, right? It was a view of faith, right? When it came to metaphysics, and that you weren't going to start getting into talking about, natural kinds and ultimate laws and things of that sort that realists like to get involved in. And so that was in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? That was quite a respectable way of trying to reconcile science and religion in a period where there was quite a lot of political conflict going on. Now, in the latter period, right, in the period we live in now, of course, somebody who follows that kind of lineup, and you're probably familiar with him, Bas van Fraassen. Okay, and it's not, and Bas van Fraassen is kind of like a latter-day Duhemian, and not surprisingly, he's also a kind of religious guy. And he holds this kind, and he holds a much more sophisticated version, because he actually gets into some detail about the ways in which different technologies actually transform observational capacity, right? And the way in which, in some sense, technology can open up, as it were, the horizons for experience and so forth. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's getting at any kind of ultimate reality. And so this instrumentalist strand is there, right? It's certainly there, I think though I'm hardly the kind of guy who would be regarded as a poster boy for realism. Nevertheless, I do think that the power of realism as a kind of metaphysics of science is that it keeps prodding you to transcend whatever level of instrumental success you might have in science, right? In other words, you don't make, as it were, the scientific enterprise correspond exactly to just getting things that work, right? But rather you're looking for something beyond that. So you're always testing the limits. And again, this is the Baconian imperative, right? That yes, in some sense we can have a reliable understanding of the world, but is that good enough, right? There might be more of the world out there that in a sense we need to find, right? And that then spurs the kind of more realist imperative and opens you, by the way, to the possibility that you may encounter a version of reality that's radically different from anything that observation normally provides, right? I mean, so because that's the other problem with instrumentalism in a sense, instrumentalism becomes kind of tricky when you start talking about the strange physical phenomena that we run into with quantum mechanics and so forth. It's almost as if all you're doing is, filling in equations, and that there's nothing more to it than that. So sure, there is this instrumentalist position in science, but I don't think, my bottom line is, I don't think science would be as adventurous as it has been in terms of transforming the way we see the world if it were instrumentalist. It's been the realist side that has actually pushed the frontiers forward.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry, just a short question. Am I got it right? Do you treat Francis Bacon position as a realistic one?
Yeah, in the sense that we've been talking about it. Because in the sense that Bacon does not accept that the way in which the world naturally appears to us is the real way, right? He's not he's the exact opposite of an Aristotelian. He believes, in fact, you have to penetrate the appearances, right? So he makes, and this is why experimentation is so important, right? Because experimentation basically takes natural phenomena and put it under unnatural conditions, you might say.
Mhm.
The point of doing, having laboratories and these specialized places for doing research is about. It's not just about going out in the field and looking at stuff for a long time, right? Rather, it's about bringing stuff into the lab and putting it under a very special kind of treatment so it reveals new possibilities about itself. And that is I take that to be a realist impulse.
Mm.
So I'm not necessarily committing Francis Bacon to a particular realist ontology, okay? Because when we talk about realism very often, right, we're associating it with a certain kind of ontology of certain kinds of objects and certain kinds of relationships between the objects and so forth. And I realize there are many kinds of realism, and I'm not trying to commit Francis Bacon to any of those, but in terms of the basic realist kind of orientation to science, that I would commit him to.
Oh, I see. My question was connected with the thing you were talking a lot about mathematics, but
right.
You look at the way Francis Bacon was treating mathematics and its role in physics. It seems to be completely instrumentalistic.
You're right.
Why he was rather critical towards Galileo, Descartes.
No, you're right.
Their realistic interpretation of mathematics.
You're absolutely right. Bacon wasn't perfect. No. Bacon had these Aristotelian residues, I would call them, right? Because Aristotle also had a very restricted view about the role of mathematics in science, right? I mean, Aristotle had like metaphysical views about certain things can be measured and certain things can't, I mean, stuff like that. So yes, Bacon still had those kinds of Aristotelian prejudices. He was not a completely self-emancipated person.
Quite right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have anybody? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I see you there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the beginning, you presented your view as an alternative between two theses about the relationship between science and religion. So not opposition, not complementarity. But as I understood it, I see your view as a variation of the complementarity thesis, in the sense that science complements the Christian religious project of humans as being made in the image and likeness.
No, it's not. Well, let's put it this way. If that were true, then the scientific stuff would not have been so controversial when it was put forward. I mean, I think you have to take seriously the idea that a lot of these guys thought that the science that they were doing was improving the theology. Right. So in other words, and in that respect, they were providing a challenge to church authority. So it wasn't complementary, really. It was kind of so in other words, that they thought that you do better theology by doing science than just by going to church or reading the Bible a lot. Right. I mean, there's a sense in which I think this is kind of what their view was. And I think that's a much more challenging view. It's not really complementary. I mean, not in the sense in which complementary is normally used, because as I was saying, and I think Lil presented it this way last week, and it's correct, namely, people who hold a complementary view between science and religion generally feel that science and religion are satisfying different aspects of the human being, right? You might call the science side instrumental or whatever, right? And the religion side, you call it faith, you call it spirituality, whatever, right? And these things exist in a kind of complementary way. But I don't think that's what the scientific revolution guys were about. These guys were about using science to complete the project of theology.
Yeah, this is sorry, my connection collapsed, and I wanted to elaborate a little bit on this, because you mentioned that scientific displacement was not about making human beings smaller, but rather making them bigger. So
that's right.
You beings able to enter the mind of God, and
that's right.
This is exactly compatible with the view that humans are made in the image and likeness of God.
Right.
If we understand this statement not as a factual statement that was true at the moment of creation, but rather as a project that is folding in history. So science, especially after its interpretation with technology, allow us to make true that humans are being at image and likeness of God, because in this sense, Christian religious, it provides not just the framework, but also the goal and the objectives of
Look,
science.
you know,
That's why I saw this complementarity.
No, see, I actually agree with your account, right? So I agree with your account, but I don't think you can call it complementary. This is my point. Because I think it's a very controversial, what you're doing is basically giving a very controversial reading of Genesis, right? Which turns the image and likeness of God into a project in which technology is an important component. I think that starts to move far beyond the Bible, it seems to me. Okay, and I'm not saying it's incompatible with the Bible, but it seems to me that, you know, you're making a move kind of like what Galileo did, right? This is kind of the way Galileo read the Bible, right? And that got him into all kinds of hot water because, in a sense, you know, he was saying the Bible just starts the story, almost, right? That in a sense the Bible lays down some of the major markers, right? It says we're creating the image and likeness of God, but then it's up to us, right, to redeem that kind of idea with our technology and our science and all that jazz. And that's what Galileo was basically trying to convince the church of, which they didn't buy it. But the point is that I would not call a complementary view. This is the point. That is a view that actually does, when it gets right down to it, challenge church authority, right? Because when we think about religion, right, I mean, it's one thing to say that science is compatible with Christianity, and everything you said is correct. The problem is Christianity is institutionalized in particular churches, right? And these churches have doctrines, right? And they have rituals, and they have political power and all the rest of it. And it then becomes very difficult, actually, to maneuver around that space. You can't just come up with your own view of Christianity and expect to get away with it, right? Unless you become a Protestant, of course. And in a sense, the Protestant Reformation was about that, right? The people who walked away from the church and as it were, created their own versions of Christianity. And a lot of these guys from the scientific revolution were just that, okay? Yeah. But by the way, just one final point, because one person I didn't mention who was very, very instrumental in coining this phrase scientific revolution was Herbert Butterfield. I don't know if you know about him. He was the professor of modern history at Cambridge in the second post-World War II period. He wrote one of the major influential books on the origins of what he called the scientific revolution. And his point was that the scientific revolution was the second most important event in human history after the birth of Jesus, and it redeemed Jesus. So you'd love this guy. You should read this guy, Herbert Butterfield. But that's one of the contexts in the English-speaking world, certainly, right, in which this phrase scientific revolution was coined.
Yes, thank you. And if I can follow up on this, what happens once science and technology makes humans in the image of God, while in the meanwhile, all the process and the secularization and so on made the concept of God something empty?
Well, I mean, obviously people worry about that. I'm not so sure it's so straightforward, though. You know, okay, let me, you know, it's a very complicated question, but I'll leave you with to think about this kind of way of getting into it. You familiar with Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics? You've heard of him, right? Okay, so his last book is called God and Golem Inc. Okay, and this is 1964. He wrote this book, and so this book is actually a meditation on our potential to create artificial intelligence. What does that say about us and our godlike capacities, right? And he thought, and he said, for better or worse, he said the better that the artificial intelligence becomes, right, the more we will have proved our godlike capacity, right? And there is an argument to be made that if these machines replaced us, we will have done the job. In other words, God would become this kind of self-expiring being that would then enable creation to carry on by itself. And that would be kind of the ultimate vindication of God's existence. Right? It resonates with a certain kind of the certain forms of deism in the 18th century had this kind of angle on it that God does stuff so well he makes himself obsolete, right? Yeah. Yes, but that's something to think about. Yeah.
Eric, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, you've been quiet up there. Yeah, you with the hand up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. I really enjoyed it, and it's quite thought-provoking. I would perhaps try to test the opposite of the opposite thesis. That in the end, what you are saying is actually it is a oppositional model, in the sense that okay, we are moving away. This science are conditioned by theology, and in a sense, it's a kind of heretical theology, which needs a kind of pure liberation understanding of transgressing limits, in a sense. But then again, it makes the notion of orthodoxy and faith impossible if you're going to be kind of in the line of history, in the line of science, and so on, which in the sense one could argue is a kind of oppositional view after all. That's just my
no, you're raising an interesting point about where is faith in all this. See, I think I mentioned a few minutes ago about Pierre Duhem and that whole fideism business of trying to make a separation between what science can provide and what faith can provide. I think that is part of what his concern was, that in a sense the role of faith might entirely disappear. Now this is an issue actually that during the period when there was natural theology, which was when natural theology was a big deal. I mean, of course, there's still natural theology in a way, but if you go from, let's say, the mid 18th century, this is the period basically when these arguments for the design arguments for the existence of God, right, where you basically you basically think of the world as Newtonian, and then you think about God, creating the world with this Newtonian world with a purpose, right? People like Paley and so forth. If you look at that natural theology tradition from the late 18th century to, let's say, the late 19th century, there is quite an active discussion about what revelation does, right? So if you imagine, revelation, this kind of faith thing, right, that doesn't involve you kind of rationalizing what's going through the mind of God business, but somehow making yourself open to believe in God. They very often associated that with a kind of aesthetic experience, right? So in a sense, faith becomes this kind of aesthetic experience of the harmony or the wholeness of reality, right? Which then provides a kind of hospitable space where one can then do kind of the more nitty-gritty kind of scientific work, right? So space becomes, it's this sort of attitude of receptiveness to the world. And revelation basically gets described this way. And sometimes, if you look at latter-day natural theologians, especially in the Anglican Church, so I'm thinking of somebody like Alistair McGrath. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, right? He's a natural. You know who he is, then. You do know him, okay? Well, he talks this way, right? And so and in a sense, that's what faith becomes, right? This kind of receptiveness to the world, right? That then enables us to figure out, what it's all about. Now you might say, well, that's not much of a notion of faith, is it? I mean, I want something a little more Kierkegaardian or something, right? I want something with a little more existential bite to it, right? Where like my life is on the line kind of faith, right? And Pascal and all of that jazz. But the natural theologians tended not to go down that way, right? They tended to have this kind of more aesthetic notion. I must admit, I'm not drawn much by it myself, and I do think the point you're raising is a serious one about where does faith belong. Because if you don't have a really strong kind of Kierkegaardian notion of faith, where it's all about the trembling of my being and all of this kind of stuff, then I think faith kind of loses its punch, right? And so, but where does that fit when you have this kind of scientized view of religion? That's still an open question. That's still an open question.
Okay. So we have no more questions. I had one, but we'll discuss it on our own time or in a blog or somewhere else because we are running out of time slowly. Oh, well, we are over time. It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you all for coming and for the lively discussion. And stay tuned. We are having another lecture coming up next week on Thursday, a little bit later. And we are going back in time to the, I think, 3rd and 4th century. It will be a mix of Plato and Galen and one of the Desert Fathers, Nemesius.
Before Augustine.
Yeah.
Before Augustine.
Augustine. And David Dunsbury will be with us. So, but you will be informed. Thanks again, Steve, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.